English translation 485th contact. Saturday, 9th of January 2010, 1542 hours.
Already here, and then both together. Welcome and greetings, dear friends.
I also give you my greetings.
To which I myself join you.
Well, then we ought to get straight to my concern.
Let us do that. Yes, Florina did extensively observe the January meeting of the core group and brought us the records of it after you instructed her to do so that we could take note of the whole thing. And after we had done so, we felt that it was important to seek you out on this matter. For what we have taken in and recognized from the records indicates to us that certain group members have still not settled into the core group community in a true and correct manner. Some still wander astray in fulfilling community and mission duties, and unfortunately all too often they pursue purely personal interests and are willing to neglect community and mission duties. For this reason, we have decided that Quetzal and I will come here together, and that to this end, our substitutes for our other duties will be brought in. What we were able to discern from the records was, unfortunately, not pleasing in relation to one particular matter, namely that which you described as unconstructive talking about which there was a mistaken rebellion that it was very much constructive, and moreover, free speech. Quetzal wants to comment on this.
It is of correctness that there must be freedom of expression in every respect. But all that we have learned from the records has nothing to do with real opinions, but with ill-considered expressions that were based on purely personal gain. As you yourself aptly said, the whole thing corresponded in the main to an unconstructive talk, which was just thoughtless utterances without any real arguments. A worthless, meaningless, and banal talk for 120 minutes, based only on personal confused views and opinions, and not at all on actual facts and on appropriate proposals.
What Quetzal says is in line with what we all have said, and we find it very regrettable that such incidents occur again and again, although it should have been expected for a long time that such incidents would not occur again.
This expectation is justified, because since everything has changed for the better by bringing understanding and reason and a good order to bear, such empty talk, which often takes a pointlessly long time, should not occur again. Basically, those core group members who are still acting in this wrong way should at last reflect on their understanding, and reason, and cultivate good thinking and reasoning in order to produce good and valuable ideas, from which constructive forms can be derived or result, as you have said true. But what emerged from the records is that no real arguments were put forward, but only personal and banal motives, which were aimed at achieving personal advantages that could never be reconciled with a communal attitude, and which aimed at shifting more work and responsibility onto other members in order to be taken up less by the community itself.
I also see this in the same way as everyone else with whom we have consulted. The whole talk, which I call gibberish according to your meaning, had nothing to do with free speech, but with childish attempts to change, talk away, and dissolve things without argument and by coercion, which are well tried and must not be changed under any circumstances. If these tried and tested things were to be dissolved, then problems of an unsolvable form would arise and bring about a new state of affairs, which would be similar to the one that existed before, and consequently, the old and overcome difficulties would be rekindled and reappear. The same situation would again arise as it was before the guidelines and rules that were worked out and established by us through your authoritative advice and collaboration, through which an order satisfactory in all areas was established, and through which the mission began to develop in an unexpectedly good way. The whole of the earlier difficulties must not be broken again by the unreasonableness and inexperience of life, as well as by quarrels, etc., of certain newer and younger core group members. Under no circumstances must it lead back to the old grievances and not call the existence of the mission and the community into question again, as was the case in the early years. This before the rules and law and order proposed by us and accepted by the core group as a whole through a unified decision have begun to take effect and have brought unexpected and immeasurable and valuable success in all these years. Since the introduction of the guidelines and rules as well as the law and order at that time, the cooperation of all core group members has brought about achievements that were much more than could be expected. Also, what you were able to accomplish with regard to the books you created goes far beyond what you should have done. But all this was only possible because the order and cooperation of all core group members was thoroughly effective, creating a climate of joy in what was generally done and accomplished by each individual with full commitment. Each did his or her assigned duty, and was no longer selfishly intent on gaining advantages at the expense of other group members. But what we have filtered out of the records shows the opposite, and indicates that certain core group members are on the way to falling back into the old destructive forms. The fact that truly childish statements are being made in this process, that Quetzal and I myself are not always to be consulted, and that this can also no longer be done when you are no longer, is evidence of an intellectual and rational inadequacy. But it also shows that there is still a great immaturity in the evaluation of real facts and an inability to solve problems, as we have undoubtedly seen from the analysis of the records of some of those who rebel.
The reason this whole banter actually took place is because I realized, through an instigation from a core group member, that there was something wrong with the holiday schedule, and that for about a decade the 2nd of January was considered a Sunday, and as such, it figured in the Sunday duty roster. So I tried to clarify the matter by bringing it up at the meeting to have a vote on whether or not the 2nd of January could be removed from the Sunday duty list. Because this day is not an official Sunday, but just a simple Friday day off. And I think that I was right in doing so, and that it is also right that this day should be removed from the Sunday duty list by an overall decision. And I think that this is also what you want, isn't it?
That is unquestionably of correctness. So you did the right thing, because as I understand the legal Sundays and holidays, as they are given with you, the only public holiday is on the 1st of January, while the 2nd of January is actually just a normal Friday, which has no festive nature whatsoever.
Then I'm reassured, because if I screwed up, it would have been damn embarrassing. I am not happy about making mistakes because I take my responsibility seriously. Unfortunately, mistakes cannot be avoided, but they are bearable if they do not cause harm.
That is true. Unfortunately, we are also not immune to mistakes. For to be faultless would mean that we would have nothing more to learn and would be closest to perfection, which in truth, however, can only ever be attained in relative terms. If we were perfect and also flawless, we would be high above the creation.
A good word. But look at what I have written about the unpleasant events of our January meeting. It is probably good if I read it to you. So listen, please.
1. It is fundamentally wrong to dismantle, revise, change and renew what has been tried and tested, for only what has been tried and tested is of lasting value and leads to progress and success. This fact has been proven from time immemorial, also during the last 100 years in relation to the economy as a whole, for example in relation to mergers and their failure. Further on in the expansion of companies and production expansions, which were based on a horrendous debt-making, which drove companies and corporations to ruin and bankruptcy, respectively, to the final collapse. This is because the younger generations, who as young dynamic people have taken everything into their immature hands and have fallen into the delusion that they have to drive everything into the big and oversized and have to be in the first place of the economic sector concerned. This, along with the fact that they have to take on horrendous salaries, bonuses, and severance payments in order to get rich easily and quickly. All this has led on the one hand to horrendous overexploitation, and on the other hand to the collapse of long-established and profitable companies and corporations. Through the expansion, the senseless enlargement, and the increased production, which could only come about through senseless debt-making, the well-tried was destroyed. This was based on the fact that something was only renewed, expanded, enlarged, and made more rational and profitable in a company or a group if the necessary finances were saved and set aside, so that no debts had to be incurred. In addition, masses of money were spent in excess of what was effectively available, so that the finances were not allocated appropriately and true, and debts were also incurred in this respect. Wherever reason and logic were not respected in economic and financial behavior and were violated, it has been proven from time immemorial that as a rule everything was and is broken and also continues to be broken. What happened in a disastrous way in the industrial economy, in the way I have just mentioned, has also been the downfall of the banking systems. This is because the greed for money, power, and grandeur was also introduced into these systems in order to promote excessive financial and banking growth. So, it was not inevitable that a massive collapse would have to occur in the same way as in the industrial economy, as had already happened in the 1920-30s, and again in the first decade after the turn of the year to the 21st century. As a result of the banking and industrial economic collapse, a worldwide recession resulted then, and also results today, whereby horrendous amounts of state money had to be and still have to be pumped into the banks and the industrial economy in order for them to continue to exist. A fact, however, which did not prevent various small and large banks, as well as small and large companies and corporations around the world, from ending in total ruin. And all this only because of the greed for money and power, and the disregard of the well-tried basic rule that something is only bought, renewed, expanded, and made more profitable, etc., if the necessary financial means are saved and available, and are not hounded in immeasurable greed for money and wealth. This is a very bad and bank and industrial economically destructive action, which disregards everything that is tried and tested, and which is mainly carried out by the responsible company, group and bank managers, and boards of directors, and which brings everything to collapse. This criminal activity also includes the horrendous raising of capital, which is contrary to all reason, and drives the capital seekers into enormous debts. This is based on the fact that loans are only ever taken out to the extent that it is possible to repay them, with interest and compound interest in accordance with the income and agreements as they were received and paid before the loan was taken out. This means that loans do not have to be repaid according to possible additional income resulting from possible additional production and from additional sales, respectively, from possible additional profits. The illogical excessive lending by the banks to private individuals for real estate and all kinds of other things, as well as to companies and corporations, is another evil that tempts people to get into debt and is widely used. The fact that the mountains of debt and its interest rates can then no longer be reduced and paid is an inevitable consequence, and this also applies to the states themselves, whose financial management is only geared towards getting into debt. In this respect, getting into debt also means that more money is spent than earned, and consequently the states, through their incompetent financial economy, get into debt in the billions and billions with francs, euros and dollars, etc. And this is only because the governments responsible for this cannot handle money, on the one hand, and because, on the other hand, it is not their mammon that they are squandering, but that of the tax-paying people. And just as the states act and think in this regard, so do the managers and boards of directors of banks and industrial companies. So they are all disregarding the well-tried principle that not debts are made that exceed the measure of what is permissible and wealthy, and therefore cannot be repaid. 2. Tried and tested rules, decisions, and orders should also not be changed and not revised, but only replaced by appropriate extensions if necessary. If a rule, whatever its nature, has proved its worth, then extensions may only be made after thorough consideration and reflection, which must, however, be adapted to the old one, and must not change or otherwise impair it. In the case of new resolutions concerning an old and proven rule and resolution, etc., the mistake is always made of repealing the old and proven and replacing it with new rules and resolutions, etc. This, however, disregards the rule of what is good and correct, namely that the well-tried and strictly thought-out rule has brought success. On the contrary, new and insufficiently thought-out decisions and rules are being created, which destroy the old and proven. This creates new problems, which lead to more and more problems and ultimately to the inevitable collapse. 3. It is mocked in the FIGU core group that the core group does not constantly assert and maintain the orders, rules and regulations of Quetzal and Ptah, but that these should be changed and replaced by innovations, because on the one hand, they are allegedly in need of overhaul and renewal. On the other hand, Ptah and Quetzal could also no longer be given any orders, etc. if I, Billy, were no longer there, and the core group should therefore determine what was necessary, etc. Such cramped, absurd, silly and foolish pseudo-arguments, which result from an intellectual and rational immaturity and prove that a decisive life experience and a clear view of the real facts are still completely missing or at least extremely deficient. And this is exactly the point by which thoughtless and unreasonably inadequate demands are made and changes. Innovations or repeals of old tried and tested things are hedged, the repeal of which would cause insurmountable problems. Such ill-considered demands and statements are only sporadic, but they do lead to confusion on the part of one or other member, and, as a result, to worthless, pointless, and unconstructive banter which is of no use and only wastes time unnecessarily. In principle, however, the FIGU Association is aware that the members of the limited partnership are adult and independent human beings who are able to cultivate their own thoughts, to come to conclusions and decisions, and also to put them into practice. They can also make their own decisions and make true and correct decisions at the meetings of the limited partnership and bring about necessary innovations. So it is to be further stated to the said that the core group can determine very well own rules, arrangements and orders, etc., whereby this is not to happen. However, by absurdities from dogmatism, from inadequate consideration, from overestimation of one's own abilities, and from illogical desire for innovation. It is also not possible that innovations and extensions of decisions concerning guidelines and order are hedged only out of one's own personal and egoistic interest, whereby, however, the well-being of the core group community and its fulfillment of duty, as well as the fulfillment of the mission, are impaired. The FIGU core group is a community with a mission which is to be fulfilled and not easy, and these facts must be the priority for every core group member in the community and fulfillment of duty. In the direct area of a community can and may be thought and acted for the benefit of its members and in relation to its community purpose, necessarily and inevitably only in a community sense. Therefore, rules, orders, guidelines, and the community order which are given and useful to the community are always to be given priority and observed. But private and personal and, moreover, selfish desires and wishes are to be avoided. In this respect, therefore, the same principle applies in a community as in a family, in which the given rules, orders, guidelines, and the community order must be observed, accepted, and adhered to in the first place, because only in this way can family life exist and function in peace and harmony. Thus, in a community, as in a family, all members are obliged to observe and maintain a decided and proven, true and correct order, as well as given guidelines, rules, and orders. However, if this is not done properly, the result will be discord and disharmony, insoluble problems, and a roaring chaos, the end of which is the destruction of the community, respectively the family. Purely personal needs, wishes and desires, etc. must remain personal in every case and must never be brought into a community or family, because only their proven rules, guidelines, the given order and the orders to be respected and carried out apply. With regard to the Figu community, this means that a comprehensive and intentional cooperation of all members of the core group are indispensable, and that the agreed rules, as well as the orders and guidelines must be respected, so that the whole can exist comprehensively and the community can fulfill itself in its existence, as well as the duty of missionary fulfillment can be fulfilled. Personal and also selfish desires and wishes with regard to everything communal cannot be valid, because what is community-related must remain community-related, just as everything personal and private must remain strictly personal and private. Therefore, it is also necessary that time-honored rules, guidelines, orders and the time-honored order, etc. are preserved and not put out of order by unwise, ill-considered and self-centered, as well as stupid desires and wishes by innovations that are not appropriate for the purpose. The tried and tested must remain in existence with every innovation, must not be disregarded and must not be dismissed, because that which has been tried and tested since time immemorial must remain in existence, because only this guarantees that no collapse will occur if truly useful and justified innovations are added. To force new achievements and to dismiss old ones, only to satisfy personal and selfish desires and wishes, means to create problems, whereby the one follows the next, whereby chaos and finally destruction appears as an inevitable consequence. And what directly concerns our association Figu, as well as Tar and Quetzal and the Pleiaren in general, the following is to be said. The rules, orders, regulations and guidelines given by Ptah and Quetzal are absolutely justified in the long run, because they are thoroughly and logically thought out, and have not only proved themselves, but they have also proved that they are valuable, and have brought a very good and appropriate order to the core group and to the association of Figu. This is the only reason why the Figu Association has finally come so far and become what it is today, and what it can now be effective worldwide. We owe this only to the advice of the Pleiaren, especially Sim Ya Se, Ptah and Quetzal, and their spirit guide body, with whom Ptah and Quetzal work together and who gave us the good and valuable advice, guidelines, orders, rules, and order. Of course, the core group members are also involved in this, because in the end, they accepted the Pleiaren advice, orders, guidelines, and the proposed order in reason, and unanimously decided to accept it and have followed it ever since. However, this order and the guidelines can only be maintained if these given orders, rules, guidelines, and regulations remain valid and are followed to the extent that they have been thought through, worked out, and given in a logical way. To cancel them would therefore be fundamentally wrong and would bring about old, evil and destructive conditions again, which would endanger and question the existence of the FIGU Association at another time. The limited partnership members of FIGU have always been free to decide on the adoption of the whole of the guidelines, rules, orders, and order, whereby it was also adopted by unanimous decision and made into a fixed order, which has proven itself over all these years and has brought progress and success. And what was once decided in a good, true, and correct way and has been in existence for many years must be preserved, because the existence of the FIGU Association depends on this preservation as well as the good and bad of the core group, their living together and cooperation in the fulfillment of the mission. Therefore, it would be foolish, if only because of this, to dissolve the tried and tested by changes and inappropriate as well as by very badly thought-out ideas and innovations, and to replace them by inadequate sham solutions, which only bring problems. But if we wrongly pay attention to the fact that the tried and tested is being repealed, abandoned and replaced by new and inadequate ones, then chaos inevitably ensues. This would repeatedly result in all the difficulties and problems that were encountered before the well-thought-out rules, guidelines, orders and regulations were created and implemented, which Sim Yase, Ptah and Quetzal gave, and which were worked out by them with a 9-member Spirit Guide committee and unanimously accepted by the core group. That the retention of the well-tried has its justification is also proven by the fact that, because the well-tried was disregarded, rejected and strangled, whole earthly cultures brought about their downfall. This is because the peoples disregarded the rules of peace, freedom, guidelines, order and harmony, and thereby caused discord, unfreedom, disharmony, strife, hatred, revenge and retribution among themselves, and thereby created problems that could not be overcome. In the same way, the same applies to all the old things that were disregarded in relation to nature, whereby thoughtless, absurd, and inappropriate innovations were decided upon, which led to the disappearance of whole cultures through natural catastrophes. 4. In the area of the core group of the FIGU Association, there are many tasks and duties, such as the necessary night watch service, which must not be neglected and is of very special importance for the safety of the whole center and its inhabitants, as well as for the entire association property and the life of the center residents. Then there is also the Sunday and visitor service, the sale of writings, field, forest, landscape and garden work, terrain security work, writing and correcting articles for WZ and Bulletin, as well as books and the extensive computer system, in addition to the important kitchen service for the members of the core group community. Not to be forgotten are the extensive bookkeeping, the cash system and the entire administration, including banking, budgeting of the association's finances, matters with the authorities and other offices, and with organizations of various kinds, negotiations with residents, the Agricultural and Forestry Office, the Cantonal Hunting Inspectorate, the Water Authority and Customs, together with transport, etc., etc. The tasks and duties to be performed by the individual core group members with regard to the running and maintenance of information stands and the holding of lectures must also be mentioned in this context, along with many other things that must be done and completed. All these are inevitable factors which cannot be left unfinished, because they are very important for the existence of the FIGU Association and necessary for the fulfillment of its mission. The Sunday and visitor services are particularly noteworthy, to which must be added the care of visitors and the sale of publications during the weekdays. These duties must also not be neglected in any way, as they are of particular importance, especially with regard to the Sunday and holiday visitor service, which contributes decisively to the spreading of the mission by answering the visitors' questions and giving them the necessary explanations, etc., orally, face to face. The Sunday and holiday visitor services are fundamentally designed as the most important form of spreading the mission and are the actual organ of mission information, as is not the case with any other activity of FIGU. This alone is reason enough to ensure that the order of Sunday and public holiday visitor services is not changed, and that the Sunday and public holiday visitor services are not changed. Another reason for this is also the fact that many interested parties, due to their work commitments, can only come to the center on general Sundays and holidays for information, etc., which is not possible on weekdays due to their work commitments, etc. In order that the distribution and fulfillment of tasks and duties of the FIGU core group members takes place evenly and fairly, it is necessary that there is an extensive common cooperation, and that every core group member fulfills his tasks and duties without any ifs and buts. If this is not done, however, there is a restriction and even a neglect of the mission, whereby the fulfillment of the mission is irresponsibly neglected and its expansion is impaired, and in certain parts even made impossible. Such behavior, in which the tasks and duties are not only negligently or insufficiently performed and only reluctantly fulfilled, also leads to a collapse of community spirit in every way. Consequently, new and ever worse problems are constantly arising, which can no longer be dealt with rationally and logically, which can no longer be solved, and which give rise to generally hostile aspects that are hostile to the community. Each core group member of the FIGU has chosen his or her membership in the FIGU with all the trimmings, and it is irrelevant whether this was done before or after applying for membership in the FIGU. FIGU has never exerted any pressure to join, nor has it exercised any kind of obligation or promise to fulfill its duties and obligations, and therefore, for each member of the limited partnership, as well as for each passive member, an absolute self-determination to join FIGU has been and is given. What is required is simply a healthy and correct sense of community, such as good and correct comradeship, because only through this can the FIGU community exist. And it was clear to every member from the very beginning of membership that FIGU membership is connected with certain general obligations, tasks as well as with special duties, and that these can be extended in the course of time. In this respect, however, everything is voluntary, but the aim is that all members of the FIGU community, both limited partnership members and also passive members, can benefit from it and are not disadvantaged in any way. This was and is clear to all members of the FIGU community from the very beginning, and was also accepted by them, as well as the fact that every member of the FIGU community and passive member is free to express his own opinion. It was also accepted from the very beginning of the membership that in the course of time new group internal obligations as well as appropriate changes, new tasks and duties appear, in which consequently an insertion and adaptation is necessary. And these new obligations, tasks and duties simply to shift to other members, corresponds neither to a good and valuable sense of community, nor to a comradeship connected in love. But these things are taught from the bottom up in FIGU and are known to all the members of the core group, just as it was necessarily told to each individual that it is inevitable that each member, voluntarily and according to his ability and capacity, places himself in the group's internal obligations, tasks, work and duties, and also fulfills them. And to comply with this, each member of the limited partnership has decided for himself without violence and coercion or any other influence, and whoever denies this punishes himself by lying.
So much for my explanations and the view from which I see and judge everything.
Everything you have read to us corresponds to what is necessary to say and explain.
Everything is of correctness, and all your explanations and statements are so well thought out and formulated that there is no doubt and everything is clear and understandable. It amazes me again and again when I hear or read your explanations and statements as well as your concerns, how precisely and comprehensively you approach everything and know how to present it, that no doubts can remain.
Your speech seems very familiar to me, because I heard it yesterday and also today when I spoke with Andreas, because as FIGU president, I naturally informed him about what I had written and how I see things.
I can only agree with Ketzel's words and say that I am also constantly amazed at your skill in carrying out, explaining, and explaining everything. Unfortunately, I am missing this ability as you have mastered it.
With your father's Svath, I had an excellent teacher. I owe him everything.
You are forgetting yourself. Dear friend Edward, because what you received from my father you had to learn on your own, along with everything you learned on your own initiative, and that is not exactly little. But what you have now read to us is, in my opinion, all that can be said in this unfortunate matter. So there is probably nothing more to be added.
I have something else of Bernadette's that I would like to read to you as well. It is not relevant to what we have been talking about so far. But if you want to listen, I think the whole thing is well written, but it is not related to what we talked about so far.
Let me hear it.
Now the title is Thoughts on Developments.
For my part, I do not think what you read is part of the topic we were discussing, so you should not openly weave it into our conversations either. What Bernadette is saying does not directly refer to community and missionary matters, but to purely private and personal matters, which must also be treated as such. Therefore, if Bernadette is interested in presenting her remarks, then she can only do so privately and personally, although it must also be allowed that she can present her concern to all group members at an official meeting.
This is also my opinion. Private and personal matters must not be mixed up with missionary and community matters and with community duties, as you also clearly stated in your explanations and statements read out to us. Everything must be clearly separated, because if private, personal and missionary and group matters respectively, community matters, and community obligations are mixed together, then inevitably conflicts and problems arise which have a destructive effect.
Good. I will skip your written work and not include it in our conversations. But see here this newspaper article, which I also want to read to you. I find the whole thing very banal, thoughtless, and meaningless, which is why I have taken the liberty of commenting on it in my own words. And that is what I have done with this article here, which I will publish in the June special bulletin. I would also like to read this one to you and listen to your opinion. But first the newspaper article here.
Islamist terrorists do not represent Islam, as well as terrorists of other faiths do not represent the other religions.
As a human being, born as Edward Albert Meier, called Billy and Sheikh Mohammed Abdallah, etc., I have gained a good insight into Christianity as well as into Islam and the other religions and many of their sects from childhood on, but all my life I have always taken and kept a completely neutral attitude towards myself and my thoughts, feelings, views, and opinions. Basically, according to Islam, I am a religious infidel, and from the point of view of Christianity, a heretic and atheist. Or from another and sectarian point of view, a lost and hell-bound, etc., because I distance myself from any religious and sectarian belief. With this, I am also not afflicted by the God delusion, as this is indoctrinably hammered into the believers by the false teachings of the religions and all their sects. For these reasons, I am also able to make a true and neutral assessment of things that are actually or apparently connected with faith, religion, and sectarianism. This is the case, for example, with Islamist terrorism, which has no connection whatsoever with Islam proper, but is based on a misguided and completely degenerated fanaticism. Unfortunately, it is the case that wherever terrorist acts take place, they are immediately associated with Islam, as well as with other religions, depending on the religion to which the terrorists belong. In the present time, it is mainly Islam that is the target of insults to human beings. This is precisely when acts of terrorism are committed by fanatical Islamists. Terrorist Islamists, however, have nothing to do with Islam in the way that they would represent it, because they are indeed degenerate religious fanatics who interpret the Quran and the Islam resulting from it according to their own criminal discretion in their own fanatical favor, in order to be able to spread murder, death, and destruction without restraint. Through this wrongdoing of the fanatical, delusional Islamist terrorists, their crimes are only too quickly and too readily associated with Islam. On the one hand, however, Islam has nothing to do with them at all, and on the other hand, the fanatical Islamist terrorists are not real Muslims, but only shabby creatures who quite deliberately use Islam as a pretext for their degeneration of their murderous and criminal actions. Thus, Islam is repeatedly in the headlines of the public media as a result of recent terrorist atrocities and crimes, which is of course also the case with all other religions when terrorist degenerations and crimes are committed in their name. At present, however, it is Islam that is being abused by the fanatical Islamists and those affected by a degenerated religious mania and made into a world terror. And this not only in the ranks of Christians and Hindus, Jews, Buddhists, and other people of different faiths, but also in the ranks of female Muslims and male Muslims. In principle, all fanatical, religiously delusional, and other terrorist actions are to be condemned abysmally and in the strongest possible terms, no matter whether they have degenerated into fanatical Islamism or can be traced back to fanatical degenerations of religious prisoners of other faiths. But today it is the Islamist terrorists, who are not representatives of Islam and are not believing Muslims, who push the whole of Islam, and with it far more than 1 billion female Muslims and male Muslims, into the abyss of hatred of Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and many people of other faiths. Neither the ringleaders of the Islamist terrorists, nor those who hire and learn terror from them, nor those who have already been trained as Islamist terrorists, can claim to be representatives of Islam. Truly, they are serious criminals and can in no way be called Muslims, because in their fanaticism they are degenerate and shabby creatures, and windlings who murder and destroy, cowardly, and bring the true believers in Islam into disrepute worldwide and hate all the world against them. Islam is now just 1,131 years old, basically coming from the old teaching of the real prophets, so also from the teaching as it was brought by Emmanuel, as he is also mentioned as a prophet in the Quran. Terrorist Islamism, however, is not based on this teaching of the old prophets, and thus also not on the religious book of the Quran, but on the terrorists' hateful delusion towards all those who do not follow, implement and live out the verses of the surahs of the Quran in a completely wrong and erroneous way, in a conservative, fundamentalist and fanatical way. This not in a truly Islamic way, but according to an insane and feeble-minded Islamism that has nothing to do with Islam and the teachings of the Quran. Because Islamism follows terrorist, sickly, insane and fanatical heresies, that find no equality in the Islamic religious book or in other doctrinal writings resulting from it. Islamist terrorism is a unique form of terrorism outside the teachings of the Quran and of Islam, and therefore it must not be taken as a yardstick for judging the image of Islam and of Muslim believers. But if this is done, then this corresponds to a mistake that only generates evil and hatred, whereby the wheel of hatred keeps on turning, and all terrorist actions taking place worldwide are automatically and directly connected with Islam and with Muslims in general. And this also happens when the terrorist actions are caused elsewhere and are carried out by Christians, Hindus or Jews, etc. So, in this respect alone, it must be differentiated and also made clear that religious and sectarian terrorism has nothing to do with religion proper, but is based on degenerations that arise from morbidly erroneous, exaggerated, conservative, fundamentalist, and fanatical, as well as delusional imaginations. It is therefore necessary to recognize terrorism in the reality of its origin, because only in this terrorism can it be effectively tackled in order to put an end to it. But exactly this is not done, because in principle Islam and Muslims in general are immediately held responsible if any terrorist actions take place somewhere. But the truth is that terror is not the product of Islam or any other religion, but the evil and criminal fruit of hateful and fanatical human beings who unscrupulously and unscrupulously also instrumentalize other human beings misled by them for their terrorist purposes. Terrorist actions, which prove to be Islamist in nature, have a very special and extremely unpleasant and malicious effect worldwide on the coexistence between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and promote hatred of those who believe in Islam, even though they abhor and reject terrorism. They want to live in peace, freedom, harmony, and love, like all other reasonable people of all peoples and religions. And as a consequence, terrorist actions are for them completely senseless, inappropriate, and criminal, as well as contemptuous of human beings and life. On the contrary, people of other faiths, mainly an immense number of Christians and Jews, believe that the criminal Islamist terrorist actions confirm their completely wrong, imaginary, and often delusional opinion about Islam and Muslims. And even when criminal terrorist actions are carried out by Christians or Jews, etc., the whole thing is thoughtlessly and full of hatred unjustifiably blamed on Muslims and Islam. There is not any difference at all in this respect, but everything is simply wiped up with the same dirty rag, soaked with hatred, and thrown into the same pot of hatred. False information and misunderstanding with regard to Islam and its believers mainly cloud the senses of reason and reason to Christians and Jews and all their various sects. As a result, false views and misunderstandings arise from which all terrorist actions are condemned as belonging to Islam. It is thereby forgotten that in reality only small terrorist groups are behind all murder and destruction acts, in which misguided, fanatical, hateful, and abysmally cowardly human beings hide who commit their crimes in the name of an imaginary God. In the case of the Islamic terrorists, murder and destruction are thus committed in the name of Allah, as well as in the name of the Sharia, which is fundamentally misinterpreted by the terrorists and interpreted, so to speak, as a punishment or a judgment of God, etc. In fact, the word means something else, because it does not in any way refer to a punishment or punishment regime, but in a completely unspectacular way, it is a way that leads to the sources. The Sharia is truthfully and fundamentally briefly explained, based on a comprehensive Islamic legal system, which is essentially designed to find a correct answer to the question of how human beings should live in order to be pleasing to God. The point is that the guidance Huda that Allah is said to have given to human beings Precisely through the Quran and through the example of the Prophet Muhammad is supposed to be aimed at making life fruitful and to protect Islam believers from making mistakes. Terror, murder, torture, death, and destruction are in no way part of it and can be found neither in the Quran nor in any other Islamic religious writings. In addition to the Sharia, there is an upwardly open scale of other Islamic terms that are unpopular outside the Islamic world, such as the term fatwa, which has taken on a life of its own in the Western media, whereby, in recent times, the Iranian Ayatollah's sign of God, Jpa honorary title for a special Islamic class of scholars, and the Iranian regime are particularly to blame. They have abused Islamic law and called for the murder of the English writer Salman Rushdie and the Danish cartoonist Kurt Vestergaard. As a result, the fatwa, which the media called the death fatwa, suddenly became synonymous with the blind death sentences of barbaric Islamic regimes. By contrast, the actual meaning of the term fatwa is essentially as unspectacular as the Sharia. The truth is that a fatwa is an Islamic legal opinion that takes a stand on issues that are not clearly clarified by the rules of the Sharia, Islamic law. In the modern era from 1844 onwards, it has become modern among the human beings of Earth to make riots and demonstrations in the name of anything, and to commit acts of violence, murder, terrorist attacks, mass murder, torture, and other acts of violence and crimes, and to wreak enormous destruction. In the main, all these criminal acts are carried out falsely and erroneously in the name of an imaginary God and religion and delusional and fanatical beliefs, or even in the name of Satan and hate-filled. Furthermore, the whole thing is also carried out with the help of the naming of nature. Climate protection, animal protection, humanity and justice, etc., so that there are actually not any limits to the whole of the naming. And since we are talking about Islamist terrorism here, it is of course clear that it is based on Islam and abuses it. The Quran and the believing Muslims, discrediting them all and stirring up hatred against them by all those of other faiths, mainly Christians and Jews. This unrestrained hatred leads to the fact that in all non-Islamic countries, female Muslims and male Muslims are discredited and shunned, which inevitably makes them feel not accepted and as outcasts. Especially a very large number of Christians and Jews do not want to see or have anything to do with Muslims. And all because crazy and religiously delusional Christian and Jewish conspiracy theorists demonize Islam, the Quran, and the Muslims, and thereby stir up fear. But fear is a very evil form, because through it also boundless hatred is cultivated, and that is exactly what those want who are out of their religious delusion and hatred against Islam and its believers. The people of other faiths, like mainly Christians and Jews, who rant, curse, and scold in fear against Islam, and the female Muslims and male Muslims should overcome their cowardly fear. If they do not do so, then out of their fear they fall into the same or similar trap as the terrorists do. Consequently, they themselves become terrorist extremists in one form or another and drive themselves or others into the hands of the criminal terrorist actors. In truth, female Muslims and male Muslims living and working in non-Islamic countries do a lot to integrate themselves in their host country or new homeland. But this is especially difficult for them in Christian countries. This difficulty is also met by denying them their places of worship or parts thereof out of cowardly fear and through misinformation, as for example in Switzerland by the absolutely hair-raising and discriminatory ban on minarets, which also violates certain articles of human rights. Thus, it is tried by all unfair means to suppress the Muslim and Muslim people and to deny them the right to exist. instead of seeking a consensus in the form of an equality of opinion on the right to exist and the coexistence of different religions. The fear of Christians and Jews of Islam and its believers in the end also stirs up fear in Muslims. Consequently, this is a factor that is based on mutuality and makes a good, true, and valuable mutual understanding even worse and even impossible. Therefore, the fears of each other must be reduced and finally ended, because only in this way real rapprochement can take place between the believers of the different religions, especially between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. However, the whole thing requires comprehensive information from all sides, and that the believers of the different religions open up to each other, lose their fear of each other, behave as true human beings towards other human beings, and build good interpersonal relationships so that in the end they can live together in peace, freedom, love, and harmony. Sim Ya, say Silver Star Center, 8th January 2010, 1:27 hours, Billy.
So what is your opinion?
There is no need to comment, because the article is informative and correct.
That also corresponds to my opinion.
Short and sweet. Is that all you have to say?
You have written everything that is necessary. And that is done in a good way. But now, dear friend, we must leave you again, for our tasks call us. It is only as an exception that we have come here, for this visit was not intended, for the next one is not fixed until February 3rd. So we assume that everything has now been clarified and is also clarified and understood in the core group, and from now on true action is taken. Also, that in the future, everything will be thoroughly considered by the fallible ones before they speak up and let nonsense become loud. Goodbye, dear Edward. It is an honor for me to be allowed to call you my friend.
This is also true of me, so I am honored to be able to cherish your friendship as well. Goodbye, Ptah. And thanks for everything.
Ta's words are also very much in my mind. Farewell, my friend.
Also to you, Quetzal, my thanks and goodbye. Take care, everyone.